think saloon food was just whiskey and beans. Wrong. Cowboys and miners ate things so disgusting, so bizarre, so absolutely insane that modern people would vomit just looking at it. Today, you're getting the real menu from Old West saloons, the stuff Hollywood never shows. Raw animal organs, rotting meat delicacies, mystery stews that could kill you, and drinks that were basically poison. This isn't food history. This is a horror show. Stay until the end because the last item will make you grateful for McDonald's. Let's eat. Number 1. Prairie oysters. Aka bull testicles served raw in whiskey. Walk into any saloon from Texas to Montana and you could order prairie oysters. Sounds fancy, right? It's bull testicles. And not cooked bull testicles. Raw bull testicles dropped into a shot glass of whiskey, sometimes still warm from the castration that happened an hour earlier. You'd swallow it whole like an actual oyster, testicle and all, then chase it with more whiskey to kill the taste. Cowboys believed prairie oysters gave you strength, virility, and courage. It was a rite of passage. New ranch hands would be challenged to eat one to prove they were tough enough for the work. If you refused or gagged, you were mocked relentlessly. Some men claimed they loved the taste. Most were lying. The texture was described as slimy and rubbery, and the flavor was intensely gamey with a metallic aftertaste from the blood. Saloons would get fresh testicles delivered from nearby ranches during castration season in spring. They'd keep them in buckets of brine or whiskey to preserve them for a few days. By the third or fourth day, they'd be turning gray and starting to smell, but cowboys would still eat them because wasting food wasn't an option. Some saloons would fry them if customers requested it, but eating them raw was considered more authentic and manly. The practice continued well into the 1900s and still exists today in some western states as Rocky Mountain oysters, though now they're always cooked and served as a novelty dish. But in the Old West, raw prairie oysters in whiskey was standard saloon fare, and refusing one marked you as soft. Number 2. Son of a gun stew, made from internal organs and whatever didn't rot yet. Son of a gun stew was the most common meal in Old West saloons because it was cheap, filling, and could be made from literally anything. The base was whatever internal organs the butcher couldn't sell: heart, liver, kidneys, intestines, lungs, and brains, all chopped up and boiled in a pot with water, salt, and maybe some onions if the saloon was fancy. But here's the thing: refrigeration didn't exist. Meat would start rotting within hours in the desert heat. So saloons would take meat that was starting to turn, cut off the really bad parts, and throw the rest into the stew pot. The long boiling time killed most bacteria, and the strong seasoning covered the taste of decay. Cowboys knew the stew was made from sketchy ingredients, but it was hot, it was protein, and it cost almost nothing. The name Son of a Gun came from cattle drives. Chuck wagon cooks would butcher a calf, and while cutting, they'd sometimes accidentally slice open the stomach and intestines. Everything would spill out: blood, partially digested grass, stomach acid, waste. Instead of throwing it away, they'd rinse it off in a river or creek and toss it in the stew pot anyway. Hence, son of a gun, a polite way of saying this stew is made from nasty shit we pulled out of an animal's guts. Some versions of the stew included bone marrow, which cooks would crack open and scrape directly into the pot. The marrow added fat and flavor, but it also meant you'd occasionally bite into chunks of splintered bone. Saloons would keep a pot of son of a gun stew simmering on the stove for days, adding new ingredients as they became available, never fully emptying the pot. By day 3 or 4, the stew would be thick, dark, and absolutely foul-smelling, but men would still eat it because they had no other choice. Number 3. Coffin varnish whiskey that was literally poisonous. Whiskey in the Old West wasn't whiskey. It was industrial alcohol mixed with whatever the saloon owner had on hand to make it drinkable. The cheapest version was called coffin varnish, rotgut, or tarantula juice, and it could actually kill you. Saloon owners would buy barrels of raw grain alcohol, which was about 95% ethanol, then cut it with water to reduce the strength. But straight grain alcohol and water tastes horrible, so they'd add ingredients to improve the flavor and color. Common additives included tobacco juice for color, turpentine for bite, gunpowder for a burning sensation, strychnine in small doses for a stimulant effect, and sometimes cayenne pepper molasses or burnt sugar. Some saloons added formaldehyde to preserve the mixture and keep it from spoiling in the heat. Yes, embalming fluid, the same chemical used to preserve dead bodies. Cowboys knew the whiskey was terrible and dangerous. They could feel it burning their throats and stomachs in ways real whiskey didn't. But it was cheap, it got you drunk fast, and after a month on a cattle drive sleeping on the ground and eating dust, you didn't care about quality. You just wanted to forget. Men would drink an entire bottle in one sitting, wake up blind or partially paralyzed from the poison, then do it again the next week. Some whiskey was so bad it would strip the varnish off the bar, hence the name coffin varnish. Bartenders would test batches by pouring a shot on the wood bar. If it ate through the finish, they'd add more water. If a customer complained about the quality, bartenders would remind them that the goal was to get drunk, not enjoy the experience. And if you wanted real whiskey, that cost 5 times as much, which most cowboys couldn't afford. Deaths from alcohol poisoning were common but rarely reported as such. If a cowboy drank himself to death in a saloon, it was written off as a heart attack or just the rigors of frontier life. The saloon owners faced no consequences because there were no health regulations or quality standards. They just dragged the body out back, sell his belongings to pay for burial, and serve the same poison to the next customer. Number 4. Pickled pig's feet that sat in jars for months. Walk into a saloon, and you'd see big glass jars sitting on the bar filled with murky liquid and pale, bloated objects that looked like alien appendages. Pickled pig's feet. Not fresh pickled. These had been sitting in vinegar brine for months, sometimes years, slowly decomposing and absorbing flavors from the dirt, dust, and tobacco smoke that filled the saloon air. The pig's feet would be boiled first to remove hair and soften the skin, then stuffed into jars with vinegar, salt, and maybe some spices if the saloon owner was feeling generous. The jars would sit on the bar, unsealed or loosely covered, exposed to everything. Flies would land on them. Dust would settle in. Men would reach in with dirty hands to grab a foot, take a bite, and throw it back if they didn't finish it. By the time a pig's foot had been in the jar for a few months, it would be gray, slimy, and so soft it would fall apart when you picked it up. The vinegar would be thick and cloudy with dissolved tissue and bacteria. The smell was described as somewhere between spoiled meat and chemicals. But it was free bar food or close to free, so cowboys would eat them while drinking, gnawing on the rubbery skin and cartilage, spitting out the bones, and washing it down with rot-gut whiskey. Pig's feet were popular because they were cheap to produce and nearly impossible to spoil worse than they already were. The vinegar acted as a preservative, and the high salt content killed most bacteria. But the conditions in saloons, hot, dirty, exposed to the elements, meant the jars were basically fermentation experiments gone wrong. Some feet would develop a fizzy texture from gas-producing bacteria. Others would turn colors that shouldn't exist in nature. Cowboys ate them anyway. The worst part was the aftertaste. The vinegar and decomposition byproducts would coat your mouth and throat for hours. Men said you could taste pickled pig's feet the next morning, mixed with a hangover and regret. But in a world where food options were limited to saloon garbage or cooking your own beans over a campfire, pickled pig's feet from a questionable jar were considered a treat. Number 5. Hardtack biscuits that could break your teeth. Hardtack wasn't technically saloon food, but saloons served it when cowboys on cattle drives would stop in for supplies. Hardtack biscuits were flour and water mixed into a paste, rolled flat, cut into squares and baked until they were harder than wood. And we mean literally harder than wood. You could use hardtack as a building material. You could kill someone with it. And you were expected to eat it. Cowboys would carry hardtack in their saddlebags for weeks or months. It wouldn't spoil because there was nothing in it to spoil. No fat, no eggs, no leavening. Just flour and water baked into an indestructible brick. But it was also infested with weevils. Not might be infested, was infested. Always. Weevils would lay eggs in the flour before it was baked, and the eggs would survive the baking process. Days later, tiny white worms would hatch and tunnel through the hardtack. Cowboys had two options: throw away the infested hardtack and starve, or eat it worms and all. They ate it. The standard method was to break off a chunk, dunk it in coffee to soften it enough that it wouldn't break your teeth, then eat it quickly without looking too closely at what was moving inside. The weevils added protein, cowboys joked. Better than nothing. Some hardtack was so old and so hard that soaking it in coffee wasn't enough. Cowboys would have to smash it with rocks to break it into edible pieces. Others would fry it in bacon grease to soften it and add flavor. If you bit into a piece of hardtack wrong, you could crack a tooth or split your gums. Dental care in the Old West was non-existent, so a broken tooth from hardtack could lead to infection and death weeks later. Saloons kept barrels of hardtack for sale because it never went bad and was cheaper than real bread. If a cowboy was truly broke, he could buy hardtack and water and technically survive, though he'd be miserable. Hardtack became so associated with frontier suffering that soldiers in the Civil War and cowboys on long drives both hated it equally, but they ate it because the alternative was starvation. Number 6. Canned oysters that spent months crossing the desert in the heat. Canned oysters were a luxury item in Old West saloons. Oysters from the Gulf Coast or the Atlantic would be canned and shipped west by wagon or train, taking weeks or months to arrive. The problem was that canning technology in the 1800s was primitive. Seals failed, metal corroded, and the cans would sit in wagons crossing deserts in 110-degree heat, basically cooking the oysters inside for weeks at a time. By the time the cans reached a saloon in Nevada or Colorado, the oysters had often spoiled despite being sealed. The cans would bulge from gas produced by bacteria. When opened, they'd release a smell that could clear a room. The oysters themselves would be gray, mushy, and covered in a slimy film. But saloons would serve them anyway because they'd paid for them, and customers who'd never seen an oyster before didn't know they weren't supposed to look and smell like rotting sea creatures. Men would order canned oysters as a status symbol. Fresh oysters were impossible to get in the interior West, so even rotten canned oysters were exotic and expensive. Cowboys who'd made money gambling or from a successful cattle drive would buy a can to impress other men at the bar. They'd eat them despite the smell and texture, pretending they were delicious, because admitting they were disgusting would mean admitting they'd wasted money. Food poisoning from spoiled canned oysters was common. Men would vomit for days, develop fevers, and sometimes die from bacterial infections. But there was no way to sue or get your money back. You ate at your own risk. Saloons would claim the oysters were fine when they sold them, and who could prove otherwise? The cowboy ate them after all. Number 7. Blood sausage made from every part of the pig, including the squeal. Blood sausage or blood pudding was common in saloons, especially in areas with German or Eastern European immigrants. When a pig was slaughtered, nothing was wasted. The blood was caught in buckets, mixed with fat, organ meat, oatmeal or grain filler, and spices, then stuffed into the pig's own intestines to make sausages. The intestines weren't cleaned thoroughly. There wasn't time or resources for that. So the sausages had a distinctive smell and taste that came from residual fecal matter. The sausages would be boiled or fried and served in thick slices. They were dark red, almost black, and had a dense, crumbly texture. When you bit into one, blood and fat would ooze out. The taste was intensely metallic from the blood, mixed with the gamey flavor of organ meat and the background taste of intestines that hadn't been properly cleaned. Men would eat it with bread or potatoes to cut the intensity. Blood sausage was cheap and filling, which made it popular in saloons that catered to miners and laborers. A single pig could produce dozens of sausages, and they'd last for weeks if kept in a cool place. But cool places were rare in the Old West. Most saloons just hung the sausages from the ceiling where flies would land on them and lay eggs. By the time a sausage was served, it might have maggots crawling inside. Cooks would cut around the really bad parts and serve the rest. Number 8. Rattlesnake meat served as mystery stew. Rattlesnake was actually eaten in the Old West, but not the way you'd think. Saloons wouldn't advertise it as rattlesnake because that would scare off customers. Instead, they'd kill rattlesnakes found near the saloon or town, skin them, chop up the meat, and toss it into the mystery stew pot without telling anyone. It tasted like chicken, people said, which is code for it tasted weird, but we're calling it chicken so you'll eat it. The problem with rattlesnake meat was that if the cook wasn't careful when butchering, venom from the snake's glands could contaminate the meat. Rattlesnake venom is broken down by stomach acid and cooking heat, so it usually wasn't dangerous if eaten. Usually. But if you had any cuts or sores in your mouth, the venom could enter your bloodstream and make you sick. Some cowboys would eat stew, feel fine, then wake up the next day with swelling, nausea, and pain, not realizing they'd been mildly envenomated through their food. Rattlesnakes were also cooked whole sometimes, roasted over a fire or boiled in a pot. The meat would be picked off the hundreds of tiny bones and served on bread or mixed with beans. It was lean and tough, requiring a lot of chewing, and if you bit down on a bone wrong, you could stab yourself in the gums or throat. Saloons that served rattlesnake would sometimes display the rattles on the bar as proof of how many snakes they'd killed and served. It was a point of pride and a warning. This place is rough enough that we're feeding you reptiles, and you're paying for it. Number 9. Century eggs that were actually just rotten eggs. Century eggs, also called thousand-year eggs, were a delicacy brought by Chinese immigrants to the American West. Real century eggs are preserved in alkaline clay for weeks, turning the yolk green and the white into a dark jelly. But saloons in mining towns with Chinese populations would serve what they called century eggs that were just regular eggs that had gone bad and were sold anyway. Eggs shipped across the frontier would often arrive cracked or would spoil in the heat. Instead of throwing them away, saloon owners or general stores would sell them at a discount, claiming they were a special delicacy. The eggs would smell like sulfur and ammonia. When cracked open, the inside would be liquid and greenish. But hungry miners who'd been told these were supposed to taste and look like that would eat them, get violently ill, and assume that was just how exotic food was supposed to make you feel. Real century eggs do have a strong smell and unusual appearance, but they're not spoiled. They're chemically transformed in a controlled process. What saloons served were just rotten eggs marketed as something intentional. And it worked because most white cowboys and miners had never encountered Asian cuisine and had no basis for comparison. If a Chinese cook said this is how eggs are supposed to be, they believed it, ate it, and suffered. Number 10. Boiled beef head with the eyes still in. When a steer was slaughtered, the head was often considered waste unless you were in a saloon that specialized in economy cuts. Saloons would buy beef heads for almost nothing, toss them in a massive pot of boiling water whole, and cook them for hours until the meat fell off the skull. The entire head would be served on a platter, eyes, brain, tongue, cheeks, and all. Cowboys would pick at the head like vultures, pulling off chunks of meat wherever they could find it. The cheeks were considered the best part, tender and fatty. The tongue was tough but edible. The eyes would be left for last, and there was always some brave or drunk cowboy who'd pop an eyeball in his mouth and swallow it whole as a dare. The eye would burst on the way down, releasing fluid that tasted like concentrated beef grease mixed with visual horror. The brain was either eaten or discarded depending on the saloon standards. Some places would crack the skull, scoop out the brain, scramble it with eggs, and serve it as a breakfast dish. Brains are high in cholesterol and have a creamy texture that some men enjoyed. Others found it too disturbing to eat something they knew had been thinking moments before slaughter. But food was food, and wasting edible protein was a sin in a world where starvation was a real possibility. The leftover skull would be thrown to dogs or cracked open to extract bone marrow. Nothing was wasted. Saloons that served beef head were advertising their frugality and frontier toughness. If you couldn't handle eating eyeballs and brains, you were too soft for the West. Number 11. fried locusts after a plague swarm. When locust swarms hit the Great Plains in the 1870s, they destroyed crops and ate everything in their path. But frontiersmen learned fast that if you can't beat them, eat them. Saloons in Kansas, Nebraska, and Dakota Territory started serving fried locusts as a free bar snack after major swarms. You'd walk in and there'd be a bowl of what looked like fried shrimp on the bar. It was locusts. Millions of locusts had just destroyed the wheat fields, so you might as well eat them. Locusts would be gathered by the bucketful, killed by dunking them in boiling water, then fried in lard or bacon grease with salt. The legs and wings would get crispy. The body would crunch like a chip. The taste was described as nutty with a bitter aftertaste. Cowboys would eat them by the handful while drinking, the same way people eat peanuts or pretzels today. The problem was that locusts are not clean creatures. They eat everything, including animal waste, dead plants, and each other. When you fried a locust, you were also frying everything in its digestive system. And saloons didn't clean the locusts before cooking. They just tossed them live into hot grease and let them cook. If a locust had been eating manure an hour earlier, that's what you were eating too. Some men developed a taste for fried locusts and would request them even when swarms weren't happening. Saloons would keep jars of dried locusts like they kept jars of pickled pig's feet. They'd last for months, and when needed, the cook would dump them into hot grease to revive them. Old dried locusts would sometimes have mold or insect larvae inside them. Nobody cared. Protein was protein. Number 12. Raw liver eaten immediately after slaughter. Fresh liver was considered a delicacy in the Old West, but not cooked liver. Raw liver, eaten while still warm from the animal. When a steer or pig was slaughtered, the liver would be cut out and rushed to the saloon. Men would gather around and the liver would be sliced thin and eaten immediately, sometimes with a sprinkle of salt, sometimes with nothing at all. The appeal was the freshness and the supposed health benefits. Cowboys believed raw liver cured anemia, gave you energy, and made you stronger. It was also a test of toughness. Could you eat a slice of quivering, blood-dripping liver without gagging? If yes, you were a real frontiersman. If no, you were soft. The texture of raw liver is slippery and dense. It doesn't chew easily. It kind of slides around in your mouth and has to be forced down. The taste is intensely metallic and slightly sweet from the blood. If the animal had been sick, you could taste that too. Diseased livers have a bitter chemical taste that indicated something was wrong, but cowboys would eat them anyway because they didn't know better or didn't care. Eating raw liver came with serious health risks. Liver flukes, parasites, bacterial infections, all were common in frontier livestock. Cooking would kill those pathogens, but eating liver raw meant ingesting everything living inside it. Many cowboys developed chronic digestive issues, worm infestations, and mystery illnesses that were probably caused by eating raw organs from sick animals. But the practice continued because it was tradition, and questioning tradition got you mocked. Number 13. Sourdough starter that was decades old and possibly sentient. Sourdough bread was a staple in saloons and mining camps, but the starter used to make it was disturbing. Sourdough starter is a living culture of wild yeast and bacteria that ferments flour and water. It's kept alive by feeding it regularly, and some starters were passed down for generations, never allowed to die. The problem was that frontier sourdough starters lived in filthy conditions. They'd be kept in jars or crocks that were never properly cleaned. Cowboys and cooks would reach into the starter with dirty hands, contaminating it with whatever they'd been touching. Flies would land in it. Dust and tobacco ash would fall in. The starter would absorb all of it and keep fermenting, creating flavors that shouldn't exist in bread. Some sourdough starters were reportedly 20, 30, or even 50 years old. They'd been carried across the country, survived winters, and fed thousands of people. But they'd also accumulated decades of contamination. The smell of old sourdough starter was described as somewhere between cheese, alcohol, and decay. The bread made from it had a sour, funky taste that took getting used to. New cowboys who bit into sourdough for the first time would grimace, and ask if the bread was spoiled. Old-timers would laugh and say it was supposed to taste like that. The longer a starter lived, the more complex and strange its microbial ecosystem became. Some starters developed strains of bacteria that were unique to that specific jar, found nowhere else on Earth. If the starter died, that strain died with it. So cooks protected their starters fiercely, sleeping with the jar to keep it warm in winter, feeding it religiously, treating it like a pet. Number 14. Chuckwagon coffee boiled with eggshells and dirt. Coffee in the Old West wasn't the refined beverage we know today. Chuckwagon cooks on cattle drives would make coffee by boiling water in a pot, dumping in ground coffee or whole beans they'd crushed with rocks, and then adding eggshells to settle the grounds. The eggshells were never washed. They'd have bits of dried egg, chicken feces, and dirt on them. All of that went into the coffee. The coffee would boil for hours, sometimes all day, as the wagon moved. Dust from the trail would blow into the pot. Flies would drown in it. The cook would fish them out with his fingers and keep boiling. By the time the coffee was served, it was thick, black, and gritty with sediment. Cowboys would pour a cup and have to chew it because there were so many grounds and debris floating in it. But it was strong, incredibly strong. The caffeine content was probably dangerous by modern standards. Men would drink a cup of chuckwagon coffee and feel their hearts racing, their hands shaking, unable to sleep for 20 hours. That was considered normal and desirable. You needed that much caffeine to work 16-hour days wrangling cattle in extreme heat. Some coffee was so old and stale that it had lost all flavor except bitterness. Cowboys would mix in sugar or molasses if available, but usually they drank it black because adding anything would waste supplies. The coffee would stain your teeth black and give you stomach cramps that lasted all day. But every cowboy drank it because not drinking coffee marked you as weak or strange. Saloons served coffee that was marginally better than chuckwagon coffee, but not by much. They'd brew massive pots in the morning and let them sit all day, reheating them as needed. By evening, the coffee would be burnt, bitter, and full of particulate matter that had settled to the bottom. The last cup from the pot was basically mud. But it cost a nickel and kept you awake, so cowboys drank it. Number 15. Bear grease on everything, including desserts. Bear grease was the frontier version of butter, except it was made from rendered bear fat and tasted like what a bear smells like. When a bear was killed, the fat would be cut off, melted down in massive pots and stored in jars or barrels. It would solidify into a thick, yellowish paste that could be spread on bread, mixed into cooking, or eaten by the spoonful as a survival food. Saloons used bear grease for everything: frying eggs, making biscuits, greasing pans, and even as a topping for desserts like cornbread or pudding. It had a strong, wild, gamey flavor that overpowered everything it touched. If you ate bear grease on your morning biscuit, you'd taste bear for the rest of the day. It coated your mouth and throat, leaving an oily residue that wouldn't go away no matter how much whiskey you drank. But bear grease was valued because it was shelf-stable and provided massive calories. A spoonful of bear grease could keep you going through a day of hard labor. Cowboys would eat it straight during winter when food was scarce, gagging it down because it was better than starving. Some men claimed to like it, but most admitted it was an acquired taste that you never really acquired. You just tolerated. Old bear grease, grease that had been sitting in a jar for months, would go rancid. It would turn darker, develop a rotten smell, and taste sour and metallic. Saloons would use it anyway because throwing away food was waste. They'd mix rancid bear grease into stews or use it for frying. Hopping the heat would kill the bacteria, and the other flavors would mask the rot. It usually didn't work, but cowboys ate it because complaining wouldn't change what was on your plate. Number 16. Vinegar pie, aca desperation in a crust. When sugar, fruit, and butter were unavailable, frontier cooks invented vinegar pie. It's exactly what it sounds like: a pie crust filled with a mixture of vinegar, flour, water, and sometimes eggs if you were lucky. The filling would set into a gelatinous mass that tasted like sour, slightly sweet sadness. It was called pie because it came in a pie crust, not because it tasted like anything you'd want to eat. The recipe was simple. Mix a cup of vinegar with water, add a few tablespoons of flour to thicken it, throw in whatever sugar you could spare, pour it in a crust and bake it. The vinegar would react with the flour and create a texture somewhere between pudding and rubber. The taste was overwhelmingly sour with a chemical aftertaste from the vinegar. If the cook added too much vinegar, the filling would be inedible. If they added too little, it would be bland and disgusting. Saloons served vinegar pie when they had nothing else to offer for dessert. It was cheap to make and used ingredients that never spoiled. Cowboys would order it because it was sweet or sweet adjacent, and after months of eating salted meat and hardtack, even vinegar pie seemed like a treat. They'd eat a slice, make a face, and wash it down with rot-gut whiskey to kill the taste. Some cooks tried to improve vinegar pie by adding raisins, nuts, or spices. It didn't help much. You can't polish a turd, and you can't make vinegar pie taste good. But it existed, people ate it, and some frontier families made it regularly because ingredients for real pie were too expensive or unavailable. It represents the absolute bottom of frontier cuisine, the point where you're eating because you have to, not because you want to. Number 17, calf fries, which are baby bull testicles. If prairie oysters weren't bad enough, saloons also served calf fries, the testicles of young bulls. The theory was that younger testicles would be more tender and less gamey, which was somewhat true, but they were still testicles. They'd be sliced, breaded in cornmeal, and fried in lard until crispy. When cooked, they looked like fried chicken nuggets. When you bit into one,